Well, a very happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, John. Happy Father's Day to your dad. I'm sure you want to say the same.
Happy Father's Day, Dad.
Yep, and to my father and father-in-law as well. Happy Father's Day. And Mr. Morgan Thomas from the Morgan Thomas Show. Happy Father's Day to you as well, sir.
Hey, Mark, happy Father's Day. I'm excited to talk some Clemson football.
Yeah, I am as well. Hey, one of the things that's we've had running on the whole show today really is this whole idea of ACC versus SEC scheduling. Morgan, I know I got a couple of specific things I want to ask you, but what are your thoughts on how different the schedule for like Alabama and Clemson really is in 2019?
Oh, man, well, you know, there's always going to be that debate over whether or not the ACC has, you know, is weaker than the SEC. And I think you have to admit some things. There are some really good teams in both conferences. I think the SEC has a couple of more top-level teams, but not very many.
Yep.
And I also feel like that there is, I've said this many times, that a lot of people don't like to admit that the middle of the pack is pretty even. And they could take each other at any point, as we saw with the Belk Bowl, for example. You know, just because that there's an Alabama and that there's a Clemson doesn't mean that every other team can dominate everybody else.
Yep.
There is a lot of parity in college football, and I think the top 10 teams in the NCAA, you know, they're really good. But when you go past the 10 to, especially outside the top 25, I think it just depends on kind of sometimes how the wind blows. And I know some of the fan bases don't like to admit that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. So, hey, we're hanging out with Morgan Thomas from the Morgan Thomas Show. So, Morgan, I hit you up earlier in the week about coming on and topics we might want to talk about. And since you are a gigantic nerd like me, you were actually rewatching the spring game. I'm very proud of you for that. So what kind of insights did you take away from rewatching the spring game earlier this week?
Well, it's exciting to watch Clemson football. There's not any new Clemson football going on. It's kind of that Dabo mentioned during the spring game that it's that transformational period where the players are expected to work out a ton. It kind of makes me feel bad for not getting my beach body ready because I know those players are bulking up. They're looking good. If you watch any of the Clemson football Instagram, man, there's a lot of players that are just look a lot better than they did last year. And they looked great last year, don't get me wrong. But they're definitely putting in the work right now. So it's exciting to see what these players can do for 2019. Biggest thing for me, you know, right out the gate, everybody's talking about Trevor Lawrence. Will he have a sophomore slump or will he be a Heisman Trophy candidate? And Dabo kind of tackled it early on and said, hey, you know, when Trevor came in as a freshman, there wasn't any film on him really in the college level. So kind of had to just kind of see how he responded in certain areas, just kind of hold him over the fire, you know, and see what he can do in certain situations. Obviously, Trevor responded better than I think just about anybody could have responded in the quarterback position at a high-level university. But now that there is film, Dabo said that he's really, really pressing to get Trevor to go watch more of his film, to go see where he can improve. And one of the places that he really challenged him was to scramble and move around, not so much to run like a Deshaun or maybe a Kelly, but more to extend plays. And I felt like he actually did that in the spring game. If you go watch back, he rolled out a couple of times and hit a guy that I think is going to be somebody to watch out for in Cornell Powell. Cornell was running some routes and broke off of his routes and stopped in the middle of zones in order to get open. And Trevor found him each time, and a lot of times most of the time he was scrambling. So I think you're going to see more from that from Trevor Lawrence, is him extending plays and not just relying on his big arm.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. There have been some really good articles written this week, one on SB Nation, one by our friend David Hale at ESPN, kind of talking about what the expectations are for Trevor Lawrence in season number 2. And the ceiling is so high in those two articles when you talk about it, when they start saying, hey, he'll play in every game this year. What if he throws the football more this year? And some of the type of numbers that he could put up could be very interesting. So, hey, we're hanging out with Morgan Thomas from the Morgan Thomas Show. Again, you went back and rewatched the spring game this week. Anything that stuck out to you or anything that you feel like has some room for improvement, I guess, that you might be focused on?
Well, before we go to that, I did want to say that, if you look at it, you mentioned Trevor Lawrence and statistically wise, and, we're both nerds, so I like to look at it and see. And I thought, what does Trevor Lawrence really need what kind of performance does he need to be a Heisman candidate for 2019? A lot of the Clemson fans, including myself, would love to have a Heisman candidate or a Heisman winner. That's like the only trophy we don't really have. That's like the most prestigious one for a player. But really, it's going to be difficult, in my opinion. I mean, he's going to need 300, 400-yard passing games, more than he did last year. He's going to need to be close to 4,000 yards passing. He's going to need probably 10 more touchdowns than he had, and he's going to need it all before, really, I would say before the South Carolina game, because, Heisman voters, they're very much, what have you done for me lately? And a lot of them will go ahead and vote before that rivalry week game, and the voting, they have to be turned in before the championship game. So he's not going to be able to do anything at the ACC championship game to change anybody's mind, and he might not be able to do anything against South Carolina because a lot of people might have already turned it in. So there's a concern there, but he's going to need about 300 yards per game. And the only problem that I see with that is that Dabo doesn't do that for starters. You look at the Louisville game, for example, they scored 77 points, but Trevor threw for 59 yards with 2 touchdowns. So he doesn't keep his starters in during blowout games. And second, if you look at the games where Trevor just dominated, people like Travis Etienne don't get the ball as much. So I really don't see, even though I'd love to see Trevor as a Heisman Trophy winner. It's hard for me to say that before the season starts that he's going to have a chance.
Yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with you there as well. And I think you could put Travis Etienne potentially in the Heisman mix or Heisman conversation as well. If he can have another season where he builds on the success of last year, you could see him being invited to New York. But you're right. Maybe that's a one negative flaw of playing that many people and processing that many bodies through is it might cut down on some of the numbers long term, but a small price to pay for the success that Clemson's having right now. All right, so starting to wrap up with Morgan Thomas. So, Morgan, when you were rewatching that spring game back, man, anything that you jumped out at you where you're like, hey, here's somewhere that the Tigers could really focus going into the fall for places for improvement?
Well, we all know that the tight end position is one that's definitely a big question mark. There's not very many question marks on offense, but the tight end position is definitely a big question mark. When I went and looked at, what Jalen Lay did and what Braden Galloway did, well, the problem with Braden Galloway doing so well in the spring game is that he's not going to play. So you kind of have to scratch away anything that he did. And then when I watched Jalen Lay, he really didn't have he really didn't catch a lot of stuff. It looked like he dropped a lot of balls. A lot of times he was open. He kind of reminded me of someone who is very raw, has that height and that weight and has the look, but didn't really seem very good against blocking against guys like Tyler Davis. Tyler Davis was very, very, very slippery in the spring game, got in on a bunch of plays, which I'm excited to see. And so I still have a big question mark on tight end and Jalen Lay and what they can do in J.C. Chalk there. They're going to have to step up because Dabo wants that to be a position of importance, and right now it's kind of in limbo. But, it's only one position out of the other 11, so or the 11 total, right? But on defense, I came into it and I was really concerned with linebackers, and I looked at really from the perspective of, okay, I really want to see Shaq Smith show something. Well, we know now Shaq's not going to be on the team, and he's with Maryland now. But when you look and you really go back and watch and kind of slow it down and rewind it, Shaq seemed to be like the last man on the totem pole in the spring game. He was struggling a lot getting his footwork right. He was the one that was supposed to switch and guard Braden Galloway on the touchdown. So I felt like that the coaches obviously saw something that we didn't see, and there were some difficult conversations that were had. But for that linebacker core in January, I said that's going to be the position of concern, but it's really not going to be a position of concern. It's just going to be a position where we don't know any names. So we're going to have to learn James Skalski. We're going to have to learn Chad Smith, Mike Jones, and Jake Venables. But I think those guys are ready to play. They're obviously built and look ready to play. But Mike and Chad and James were just all over the place during the spring game. Only one thing I say is Jake Venables T. Higgins got a touchdown catch in the back of the end zone, and they panned to to Brent Venables afterwards because it was Jake's man, and Brent was not happy. But I will tell you that might have been the only time, because Jake, obviously, I mean, how could you not be a great linebacker if you're tall enough and you're big enough, which he is? How could you not be a great linebacker growing up in the house with Brent Venables?
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Well, some real good insight there. Wrapping up with Morgan Thomas from the Morgan Thomas Show. So, Morgan, your show is live on Facebook every Wednesday night at 8:30. What have you got teed up for this week?
Well, we're going to continue our popular prospect evaluations. Going to specifically look at five-star inside linebacker Justin Flo. Last week we looked at E.J. Williams and Ajo and Xavier Henderson. So a lot of fans really enjoyed that, looking at the prospects that Clemson might get for the 2020 class. And other big names that are still on the board. Still looking to do our Eyes of the Enemy segment, where we talk to opposing team experts and writers. And then, as you know, the top 5 list of the week, we had a really good one last week where we had the top 5 most hated college football teams, and Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State were all high on the list. We made sure to not have Carolina, because we know Carolina, if we had a top 5, they're all 5.
Yeah, yeah.
But we're excited to have the show, 8:30 p.m. Eastern, Facebook Live, and replays are up on YouTube, The Morgan Thomas Show.
Awesome stuff as always. Thank you, Morgan Thomas, for jumping on with us. Again, Morgan Thomas Show, Wednesday nights on Facebook. You can catch that live.